From wherever you are around the world, welcome and thank you for joining us. Today we're going to be exploring the psychology of currency manipulation with Dr. Steve Hanke. He's professor of applied economics at Johns Hopkins University. He's also senior fellow at the Cato Institute, served on Reagan's Council of Economic Advisors, president of Toronto Trust Argentina, the world's best performing mutual fund in 1995, and we just don't have enough time to cover everything. But let's welcome him to the show. Welcome, Dr. Hanke. How are you, sir?
I'm great, Carlos. Thanks for having me.
Dr. Hanke also wrote this great book, Zimbabwe, Hyperinflation to Growth. I highly recommend it. It'll really tag along with the show today. So, Dr. Hanke, I know I wanted to start off with this because this is a very difficult concept to define. Currency manipulation. What does that really mean?
Well, in fact, no one really knows. We have a biannual report by the U.S. Treasury to nail anyone who's an alleged currency manipulator. But the Treasury has had a terrible time even defining the term. They don't really define it. They say, oh, there are a number of factors that go together. And if you go back, the only ones who have been named, we have 1988, Taiwan and Korea, then 89, Taiwan and Korea again, 92, China and Taiwan, 93, China, and 93, China again, and 94, China. So, and then they basically gave up, particularly after they tried to pass the ball off to the International Monetary Fund, Carlos, in 2007, and the idea was to kind of have the IMF turn themselves into an FBI on currency manipulation and currency manipulators. And the chief economist at the time was Dr. Rajan, who's now the head of the central bank in India, and as Rajan said at the time, 2007, he said the whole exercise was an unmitigated disaster, to quote him.
Wow.
So you can see where I'm going with this. This is just a nonsense idea that politicians love, particularly populist politicians, because of course they want to blame something on a currency manipulator who's obviously a foreign country of some kind. By definition, and the problem is that word, definition. No one can actually really define what it is. So it's a very vague, very slippery kind of concept. Even the IMF, in looking at the level of exchange rates between two countries, they have three different methodologies, completely different methodologies, even to determine whether exchange rates are so-called misaligned, not manipulated, but just kind of out of whack from where you would expect them to be based on kind of economic principles. So that's the soup that we're in, and my view has always been that if you can't define something, forget it. It doesn't exist.
So it seems like they're using it to create a narrative of a certain country at a time then.
Yes. Notice the interesting thing is in the late 1980s and until about 1991, Japan was accounting for about 60% of the U.S. trade deficit, was accounted for just by one country, Japan. And was anyone ever screaming that the Japanese were manipulating at their currency? Actually, the Japanese yen was getting stronger then. It got very strong. It got up to, it went from, in 1971, the yen was 360 to the dollar, and it appreciated to 80 per dollar by April of 1991. And all that time, the Japanese were eating our lunch in terms of bilateral trade. But but no one ever said they were manipulating their currency. You notice Japan was never on that list I gave you. So there was a lot of bashing of the Japanese during that period, but not once were they ever touched as far as a currency manipulator was concerned. It would have looked kind of silly because the yen was appreciating throughout most of that period and getting stronger. Now, the Chinese have generally kept their currency fairly stable against the US dollar. It's appreciated just slightly since the crisis of 2009, but let's say it's more or less stable against the US dollar. But there's a lot of Chinese bashing going on because the Chinese have kind of replaced, to some extent, Japan as the biggest contributor to the U.S. trade deficit. So you got to go after whoever that is that's so-called contributing to the trade deficit the U.S. runs, and it happens to be China now. And China has been named, as you heard me say earlier several times, when the U.S. Treasury was in the habit of actually naming someone as a currency manipulator.
Yes, I know. So in your opinion, are they doing anything, or maybe not under the umbrella of currency manipulation? Are they doing anything else to cause unfair trades at all in regards to currencies?
Well, in regards to currencies, as we just said, it's to get out in the weeds. And are they doing anything that affects trade internationally or vis-a-vis the United States? They probably have policies that affect the currency, namely capital controls. They have capital controls, so the capital controls are one of the most obvious kind of red lights that go on, and people say, well, usually, why do you have capital controls? You usually have capital controls in a country, and many countries have them, by the way, to conserve or protect foreign exchange reserves that you have. So you're trying to corral and keep those foreign reserves that are scarce in country. So you've got capital controls that try to restrict the capital from flowing out of the country and loss of reserves. Now, that doesn't really even qualify as kind of a red light or an amber light for currency manipulation, it seems to me. What might qualify is when you have capital controls and you have very large foreign exchange reserves that there's no particular reason why you want to conserve them. So the impetus for capital controls is what? It's to keep capital from flowing in, not going out. And of course, China has capital controls. So that both restrict the flow going out and the flow going in. So you might say, well, maybe there's something in that is vaguely related to this nebulous concept and silly concept of currency manipulator.
Dr. Hanke.
You see how it starts getting complicated? I mean, it's the kind of thing that really would almost bore your listeners if we really got into the nitty-gritty of what it means and how you measure it. And how you measure it, by the way, even the IMF punted in 2007. And as Rajan said, the chief economist at the IMF at the time, he said it was a complete disaster.
Hi, welcome to Adelante. This is Adelante Recovery, and my name is Yvette Kuglin, and I'm part of the staff.
Adelante Recovery Center has helped people in dual diagnosis for 5 years. We accept most PPO insurances and provide luxury accommodations and 24-hour support. To speak with an admissions counselor, call 1-888-242-4450.
A lot of time we don't even know what's wrong with us, and sometimes we need to get away to figure that out. So if you want to go for a little retreat out in Corona del Mar, which is a confidential location we're here to help. So we're only a phone call away. Thank you.
Let me ask you this opinion. Try to clear up some of the nonsense we do hear out in the media. You always hear the story that China has all our debt and they could cripple us if they try to turn that debt in, I guess. What do you think about that?
It's another thing. This all follows what I call, I always start all my classes, the first day of the term, by warning the students that there's something called the 95% rule. And the 95% rule is that 95% of everything they read in the economic journals and the financial press is either wrong or irrelevant. And so this is one of these irrelevant things because they have a lot of U.S. treasuries, more than any other country. The Chinese do. Now, the idea, the populists like to spin this story that, well, the Chinese could just punish us and destroy the dollar and the bond market and the financial system if they dumped all this U.S. Treasury stockpile that they have. But why in the world would they want to do that? The price would collapse and they'd have huge losses. So it's completely irrational to be thinking in those terms. I mean, it doesn't make any sense.
That's why I wanted to ask you. We wanted to make sure we clear the air.
Carlos, if you had that many U.S. treasuries, you'd be wanting to go to the cathedral every day and pray that the price stayed up, and that the sellers were disappearing and dying off, basically.
Yes, I would be. Let's explore a little bit. Once again, our last myth we can get rid of here. The opinion of the 1997 Asian financial crisis, the Malaysian prime minister at the time accused George Soros of manipulating the currency. This seems to be another political ruse again. Is it so?
Well, yes, I know that story because I was very close to the epicenter of the whole thing because I was President Suharto's chief economic advisor during the financial crisis in Indonesia, which is, as you know, is a neighbor of Malaysia. So we were watching developments in Malaysia quite closely, and there were a lot of accusations, a lot of populist saber rattling by the prime minister, and Soros was an inviting target. And as I say, Soros occasionally gets almost invites somebody to bloody his nose, but in this particular case, yeah, he maybe was a seller, but there were a lot of other people that were trying to sell a ringgit at the time. He just if he was selling, and I haven't done any due diligence to know that the Soros funds were sellers. They might have been. But he was in the political crosshairs that come up whenever a politician and their currency get in trouble.
He's a primary target, huh? So let's move fast forward to today.
He certainly was there.
Yeah, certainly was. I know right now they're trying to pass some kind of legislation called the Trade Promotion Authority. What's your opinion about that new piece of legislation coming out?
Well, in general, I can make a general comment, but not specific, getting into the weeds of the hundreds, if not thousands of pages related to it. Free trade is a great thing. It boosts. It's the one guarantor of competition, and the one guarantor of increased productivity. And a lot of benefits for everyone involved on both sides of any kind of trade if it's free and voluntary. Now, this act, it's very easy to have free trade like they used to have in Hong Kong. Hong Kong was unilateral free traders, and they had a banner. They used to have a banner hanging out over the harbor in Hong Kong that the red dumpers welcome.
Dumpers welcome.
So if it's that kind of situation, I don't know why you need a 1,000-page document, a lot of negotiations and so forth. So I'm a unilateral free trade person. So I like free trade. I advocate free trade. Now the problem with these, and so in general, if you say something has a label of Free Trade Act on it, I would be warm to it. However, you always have to wear a little bit of skepticism when Washington, D.C. and other major capitals in the world get involved in some hairy negotiation of something, because as they say, God isn't in the details. Usually the devil is in the details. and one detail that they're trying to promote precisely and wedge it into this act is the notion of currency manipulation. Mm-hmm. The thing you started with, the whole takeoff on your show. So something you can't define, something that's very nebulous, something the IMF has already said is a complete and unmitigated disaster when they tried to become the cop on the block in 2007. Here we go. They don't learn anything on Capitol Hill, and they're trying to weasel this thing into the Free Trade Act, which, would be a very bad thing. So, but that's how you slice salami in Washington, D.C. And
we have about 5 minutes left, and I definitely want to cover. I thought it was a really interesting title when you put Zimbabwe, Hyperinflation to Growth. I think the normal person would say, hyperinflation to growth, how does that work? So I'll ask you, how does that work?
Well, the hyperinflation in Zimbabwe, it peaked out. I was the only one to actually come up with a very good, solid estimate of what it was, and that was in November of 2008. It peaked, and the prices were doubling every 24 hours. So it was the second highest hyperinflation in the history of the world, and finally, people in Zimbabwe refused to accept and use the Zimbabwe dollar because it was evaporating in their hands, so it was useless. And as a result, the country spontaneously dollarized itself. People started using the dollar mainly in foreign currencies, and then by early in 2009, the government officially adopted the dollar as a standard, and the situation stabilized, and they've started to grow, even though the Zimbabwe has got one bad economic policy on top of another. But one good thing they got right was stable money, but that really was not something the government did. The people voluntarily decided to stop using the Zimbabwe dollar for good and only use the US dollar and a few other foreign currencies like the South African rand.
So it's almost like a survival mechanism.
Oh, it is. I mean, stable money is very important. And hyperinflation, by the way, the definition of that is actually the prices have to go up by at least 50% per month. 50% per month.
And they did it in a matter of 24 hours?
Oh, they were going up, doubling every 24 hours.
100%. Wow.
100% a day.
Oh, jeez. That's super hyperinflation. We'll go right to today. What is your opinion about the strengthening dollar? Is it good or bad for America? Once again, I'm falling prey to the 95% of Wall Street Journal on this one, but what's your opinion on this?
Well, I think the most important price in the world is the dollar-euro exchange rate. That's the most important price in the world, and I think we should be aiming towards monetary policy in Europe and the United States. It's consistent with keeping the dollar euro rate of about 120 to 140. Right now, the rate has gone in a few short months from almost 140 down to about 1.13. So
Wow.
it's outside my zone of comfort right now, which would force me to conclude that this situation isn't so good. I mean, having something strong sounds good, but I think the exchange rate movement has been very rapid and very large, and we should be moving towards some kind of agreement that would stabilize the rate. As I say, 120 to 140. This would have to be done by some kind of agreement, so we're then again very complicated, but that's the notion.
And I guess it's an anticipation of their quantitative easing that Europe is getting ready to get into?
Right, and the anticipation simultaneously of the U.S. tightening. The rate suggests that there's some combination in here of either the U.S. the expectation the U.S. is going to be too tight, and or Europe is going to be too loose.
Wow. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Hanke. Here's his book again, Zimbabwe, Hyperinflation to Growth. I highly recommend it. Is there anywhere we can find more information about you?
Most of the material you want, go to the Cato Institute website, cato.org, and you'll find me there and books I've written, articles and things like that.
Thank you so much for being on The Circle, Dr. Hanke. I want to let you know, people ask me, what does currency manipulation have to do with psychology? Well, I'll tell you, misinformation, uncertainty, all these things we learn as we receive information. So we have to protect ourselves, and developing a comprehensive view of human behavior and today's important issues will give us that kind of shield to protect us from this kind of stuff. The more we know, the better we understand not only ourselves, but the world around us. Thank you very much for joining us. Remember, our motto is simple. Wherever there's psychology involved, even in currency, we're there. See you next time, everyone.